watching the same game, Kyle. I know you're playing it.
I have no idea. Howard Balzer joins us now. Go PHNX.com. You can follow him on Twitter at HBalzer721. Is this offense going in the right direction, Howard?
Well, I think I know what Kyler was getting at, and I think that, sometimes I wonder, quite honestly, with some of the interactions I have on Twitter, if people were actually watching the same game that I was watching. Because they'll say stuff and criticize stuff that actually did not happen in the game. And so, I thought Murray and the passing offense had one of its one of his better games last week. Now the two interceptions obviously are negatives, and they killed them. And those were huge turning points because they turned into touchdowns. And the Cardinals, when they forced a turnover, could only get a field goal out of it. But Murray completed about 75% of his passes, over 300 yards. And I thought, heck. And here's the thing about it. I just have to, like I said, I'll listen to some people talking and even, saying how pathetic it was Sunday, what a crap football it was. I'm saying, this team was actually leading the Vikings at one point in the second half, scored 26 points on a team that's 6-1 with a makeshift offensive line. And I'm going, yeah, there's some bad things. I get that. But to talk about it as being crap and pathetic, it's just talking points. And that's what we've come to. And so, but where there is an issue, absolutely, is running the football. And there was virtually no running game against the Vikings last week. Benjamin and Darrell Williams, who's now an injury reserve, combined for 30 yards. I think it was on, let me see here. I believe it was on like something like 12 carries or something like that. So running the football has been a problem. There's no doubt about that. But when wide receiver DeAndre Hopkins has 159 yards, then that's a pretty good outing. And so we'll see where it goes from here. The offensive line remains a work in progress. And I had some notes in the story I wrote this week on GoPHNX.com about, this team has had 5 different offensive line combinations in 8 games. 10 different players have started games. And when you have that on your line, I was joking, guys. I was going to put something on Twitter and just say, it might be time for the Rams to find a new coach because I think the league has figured out Sean McVay.
Wow.
And of course, I'm being sarcastic.
Sure. Yeah.
But the fact is, the Rams' offense has been worse than the Cardinals this year. When you really look at it, look at the numbers, look at the production, it's been awful. And is that Sean McVay? Of course not. Is it Matthew Stafford regressing, which I've heard people say? No. They're worse than the Cardinals on the offensive line. They've had 6 in 7 games. They've had 6 different offensive line combinations compared to last year when the 21 games they played, including the playoffs, they had the same offensive line in 18 of 21 games.
Wow. Sure.
Well, now they can't block. And that's where it all begins. The Vikings, guess how many starts anybody on the Vikings has lost on their offensive line this season in 7 games? What do you think?
I'll say 3.
Would you believe 0?
Wow.
0.
Well, okay.
0.
Yeah, Howard, I hear what you're saying. I get it. We get it. Understand it. But I think it's, we've lost guys all over the place, but I really feel it's up to the head coach, if you don't have depth or not, to adjust to that. Okay, so maybe we max protect to that left side, which got 2 of your starters missing, or this or that. There's game plan A, B, and C in order to counteract that. So we can bemoan the fact and Band-Aid all over the place, but with a lot of successful teams, I remember this Green Bay team, was it several years ago, 18 different lineups that went on with the wild card and won a Super Bowl. But I think it was McCarthy at the time was coaching. He knew how to handle that and deal with that. I don't see that from Kliff Kingsbury being able to go to the next game plan to max protect to that side, to protect that side one way or the other. You see what I'm saying? How there's adjustments that aren't being made.
I'll say this about the Packers. They didn't have 18 different lineups. I remember that year when people were saying, well, they have 18 different guys on injured reserve. And I went up and actually looked at who was on injured reserve, and like 10 or 12 of them went on during the summer and they were rookies that got hurt in training camp. They didn't lose that many top players on injury reserve, and they also had Aaron Rodgers at quarterback.
Sure.
So I see your point, but yeah, you can max protect.
Yes.
You can keep in extra guys to protect.
Yes.
But then you don't have guys going out, and then you don't have guys getting open in the passing game because you don't have guys out there. And so I think, or you're throwing underneath, which the Cardinals have been doing. Which the Cardinals have been doing. That's what the Rams have been doing. I mean, the Rams. I was looking at these. These are true numbers. I'm not pulling these out of some planet. The Rams are like ranked way below, but they're 30th in offense. They're in the 20s in a bunch of categories. And then I noticed, though, they were 15th in passing yards. So I said, oh, well, that's not as bad as I thought. But then I looked a little closer, and they're 26th in average yards per pass play. And that's because they're throwing all short stuff. They get behind it. They've gotten behind in games worse than the Cardinals. Their 4 losses are all by 12 points or more, and they're not functioning on offense. So that's that you look at Tampa Bay. Look at all the changes they've had on the offensive line, and they're not functioning. And so that's what ends up happening. Last week in the second half of their game against the 49ers, the Rams had 58 yards in the second half and averaged 2.3 yards a play. I don't think anybody's accusing Sean McVay of not being creative or not trying to find a solution, but it's tough to, even if you max protect, you still have guys that haven't played together. It's all about chemistry in the offensive line. And to me, when teams struggle on offense, most of the time, and sometimes there's outliers, but most of the time it's because of an offensive line that's banged up, injured, and isn't playing together. One other example I'll give you is the Eagles. The Eagles this year, 7 games, they've had one player miss 1 game.
Wow.
On the offensive line. A few years ago, they lost Lane Johnson at right tackle for a stretch of games.
Yep.
And all of a sudden they were horrible. They just could not play offense with all the changes they had. I mean, this is the NFL. I think we all know that. It's the NFL. You're going against NFL defenses. And if you have a line that isn't quite sure what it's doing, you're going to have mistakes. And that's the thing too. You're productive at times, right? But when it's third down, whether it's red zone, when you have those critical situations in games, that's where you end up losing the matchup battle.
All right, Howard, my question is, and it's by the way, it happens to be a question that a lot of people are discussing. If indeed the next 3 games are losses for the Panthers because they are interdivisional games.
For the Cardinals.
I'm sorry, for the Cardinals, thank you. They're interdivisional games. So would that really put Kliff Kingsbury on the hot seat? Or if he goes 1-2, 0-3, obviously if he goes 2-1, that would not be the case. But what about if he's 0-3, 1-2?
Well, I mean, every coach on the hot seat, but I would find it hard to believe that a coach that helped your team get from 3 wins to 5 to 8 to 11,
okay,
and then the team takes a step back for understandable reasons in my mind that people with eyes can see, and then fire the coach. That's what everybody wants. That's all that's what we've become in this world. Everything is
3 minutes
wrong. Everybody says fire the coach, and then the first thing that happens after the coach gets fired, people say, "Well, now we got to improve the talent." Well, no kidding. That's why you're losing games because of issues with the players. It's players executing. I laugh when I hear someone say, "Oh, they had all these mistakes in the game." Greg Dortch drops a punt, and that leads to the Vikings' last touchdown, and then people are blaming the coach for that. I mean, I just find that there's lazy narratives that go on out there when teams aren't playing well. And then a lot of times teams react, then they fire the coach and they get into that whole thing of firing the coach every 2-3 years, whatever it is. And then you just fall further and further behind. And if anyone out there thinks that, does anybody really believe that another coach would be doing that much better with this team? And I hear all these calls for Sean Payton, Sean Payton. Well, there were 3 years when the Saints were really good. They had a running game, and they had an offensive line that was able to block for the running game. Then there were a few years there where they didn't have a running game before they got Alvin Kamara, They had no running game, and the offensive line had some issues. And Drew Brees was passing for 4,000 or 5,000 yards. And you know how many games they won? 7. So they were 7-9. They weren't even a playoff team. And so that's the reality of the NFL that it seems to me that a lot of people just don't see of when things happen and why they happen. And most of the time, no one wants to hear why, because then you get accused, oh, you're just making an excuse. It's not an excuse. It's reality. I mentioned the Vikings. Here's a team that is 6-1. They've won 5 in a row, and every one of the games they've lost is a one-score game. I mean, that they've won. The 5 games in a row is a one-score game. Cardinals, unfortunately, are 1-3 in one-score games. That's what separates teams in the NFL. The Vikings, in addition to the offensive line, I was just saying, they've had one player miss a start the entire season on the entire team. One player. Last week, we talked about it. Remember that? We talked about it last Thursday. Cardinals had 13 players, I think it was, on the injury report, and the Vikings had nobody. Mm-hmm. Well, that's just tough to overcome when you don't have, like on offense, when you don't have 5 starters. That's almost half your team on offense isn't on the field.
And how other guys are. And we got about a minute left here. I hear what you're saying. The one thing that I think is becoming intolerable for a former player like myself and a lot of guys is the consistent gaffes with the play clock, the penalties, the mismanagement I see week in and week out. We should have been done with that our first or second year as a head coach and with your quarterback. That's got to be figured out. That's got to be taken care of, because what it does, put you behind the sticks even more so, and then you got no timeouts left at the end of a half or at the end of a game where maybe you have 1 or 2 timeouts left. You get a shot at maybe taking a shot from 25 to 30 yards in to get a shot into the end zone and then maybe tie it up. That's what's inexcusable with what I'm seeing with Kliff Kingsbury in game mismanagement.
Well, it's a good point. And it's been talked about this week, and he's talked about it. And one of the reasons that it was even, it had some issues. Now remember, it happened maybe I don't know how many times in 70 plays that they had on offense, but everyone hones in on those handful of times it happens. But he says a lot of it is because of all the new players that they have, they decided to go to huddle, go to a huddle more instead of the no huddle that a lot of them are accustomed to. But new players, they went to a huddle so they could have better communication. But what was happening is they were communicating between themselves, but it was taking a little more time, to get it together. Yep. Well, if you change, like everyone says, make adjustments. A lot of times you make an adjustment like that in the middle of the season, and there's some positives to it, but there can also be, some negatives. But still, on the road against a team that's 6-1, even with some of these issues, they're in the game, right to the end.
Yeah.
And if it's not for the turnovers, and they scored 26 points on this team, and if it's not for the turnovers really that led to 2 touchdowns, maybe the outcome very well might have been different.
It should be happening, Howard. It should not be happening your 7-8 games into the season. I don't care if you got 25 new players. You got to manage the clock a little bit better. I'm just saying the game get away from Kliff Kingsbury at times, which I don't think should happen 4 years in as a pro coach.
Well, I've seen it happen to other teams too, and that's the thing about this league. I mean, it happens. You hate when it happens. And I'm not saying it's not an issue and you don't have to get it solved, but we all pay hyper close attention to the Cardinals. But you see with other teams, you see with coaches and teams that have been they've been together for a long time. I mean, they have issues at times in games, and that's unfortunately a reality of the NFL. And so, but you're right. I mean. But what I'm saying is there are negatives. There's no doubt about it. And I'm not trying to sugarcoat it. But everyone acts like every play is the worst thing in the world. I mean, heck, the Rams had 160 yards more than the Cardinals had 160 yards in their game more than the Rams had last week. But again, I'm not saying that makes it okay. But I think the reaction to it is just a little bit over the top. As if every play is just so horrible that they can't even function. Well, hey, they functioned to the point where they had a lead in the second half and were in the game until the very end, but they still couldn't protect Kyler Murray at key times when they had to. And that's why I come back to that offensive line. It all comes back. So much of it comes back to the offensive line playing a lot better. As Matt LaFleur said with the 3-5 Packers a couple of weeks ago, if we don't block better, you can't function on offense. And that's where it all begins. But I don't hear anybody talk about the line after the game. All they talk about is Kliff Kingsbury. And that's the world we live in. I understand that.
Howard, great stuff as always. If you want more Howard, go to gophnx.com or follow him on Twitter at hbalzer721. Howard, good